Hello, good morning. Hi, everybody. I hope you hear me well. I'm testing my mic at the moment. I will begin to introduce myself. Welcome to this next session of the QIP conference. We're going to have now a 1 hour talk approximately. The next session speaker is going to be Havi Carel, who is going to speak about how to promote social justice in academia. I'm going to be one of the chairs of this session. My name is Juan Bermejo Vega from the University of Granada. I'm a quantum computing researcher, and my co-chair is going to be Barbara Tautz, who is a diversity coordinator in Munich at MCQST. I will be doing most of the speaking, but Barbara will also be participating and selecting questions that I ask for the speaker through the Slack channel. So remember, for this session, first we're going to have a talk by Javi, and you can ask questions using the Slack channel associated to this session. You can only ask questions through the Slack channel, and if you have any clarifying questions, please ask them there. Without further ado, we'll introduce now Javi. Javi is a professor of philosophy now at the University of Bristol, who has several research interests, including phenomenology, philosophy of medicine, epistemic injustice. And although she's not a quantum researcher, she has spoken already at several quantum events, including the QTurn 2019 Quantum Information Workshop and the QIP 2019 Quantum Technologies Workshops. Javi, I let you speak and do the next of the introduction, and welcome to QIP.
Thank you so much, Juani. Nice to see you again. So it's really great to see so much interest in equality, diversity, and inclusion amongst the quantum physics community. I think, as Juani said, it's the third time I've been speaking, and each time it generated a very interesting discussion. I don't know if people know the QET lab at Bristol, but I've also spoken there. So assuming you can see me and hear me fine, what I'm going to do is a slightly shorter talk than planned, and that's because we're isolating here with because of suspected exposure to the virus, and I've got both my kids at home, and I will hope we won't be interrupted, but we'll have to make it a bit shorter than I planned. What I do encourage you is to carry on discussing over lunch or in breakout rooms or by email or with other people in your own institutions. I know discussion isn't so easy when it's all so restricted now and it's all online. But please treat this session as an invitation for you to think more and speak more about equality, diversity, and inclusion, rather than me imparting you a particular piece of knowledge and then you say, oh, I've done the training, so I'm finished. It's actually not training. It's actually an ongoing awareness and a conversation that continues to roll over time. And even in my 20 years or so in academia, I've seen enormous changes in I think a real increase in people's awareness of equality, diversity, inclusion issues, a real willingness to and a desire to develop people's capacities to recognize EDI issues and to deal with them effectively through, for example, bystander training. And of course, people really wanting and being more able, I think, to respect difference in all levels: gender, race, sexuality, disability, and so on. So the work is always still there because there are always still issues to address and iron out. And of course, people's understanding of EDI issues is very different between different individuals, different institutions, different countries. So I'm just so pleased that we are this big international forum, and we can hear about what's going on across the globe, hopefully. Okay, so how I'm going to run the talk is I'm going to be speaking. I'm not looking at my chat, but I can open the chat if needed. And I'm not seeing your questions because I'm not on Slack. But Juani and Barbara will be moderating your questions. And there will be two kinds of questions. There's clarification questions, or comments people want to make as we go along. And I'm very, very happy for you to say, can you explain this again? I didn't understand that. This doesn't make sense. So clarification questions. And at the same time, longer sort of discussion questions, contributions, points people are wanting to make that we will save for after the talk. So again, if you have kind of pressing clarification questions during the talk, please send them to Juani and Barbara. And if you've got longer questions and comments you want to make afterwards, then again, just mark them as such, and hopefully we will get to hear everybody's contributions. Okay, so I will now speak for, I think, roughly half an hour and then leave some time for Q&A. So I'm going to share my screen with you and start the presentation. If you can't see or hear me, just give me a shout at any time, of course. Okay, so here is the challenge. What we want to do is to promote equality, diversity, and inclusion in academia. We have some quite useful tools that I will come to in the talk to do that. But a lot of people feel insecure or uncomfortable or feel they lack confidence to intervene, to have an opinion, to say what they think. And I think there's a real phenomenon, at least in the UK, where people are very, very scared to say the wrong thing. So they end up not saying anything at all, which is a shame. Because what we want to do by giving this talk and trying to think about ways to promote equality, diversity, and inclusion in academia is exactly to make people feel they are able to talk, that they do understand the issues, that they do have an opinion, that their opinion is valuable. And remember, it's very easy to make changes in a local sense within your own department, within your own lab, by sometimes just by sitting down and having coffee with people and saying, so what do you think? How could we do better on equality and diversity? Okay, the issue doesn't have to be scary. It doesn't have to be a minefield. It doesn't have to be confrontational. You can sometimes just engage with people by asking to just hear their thoughts. But what I'm going to do now is talk you through the basics of equality, diversity, and inclusion. And I think some of you who are in the audience, certainly Juani has already heard me speak to this. I will be quite quick. I think the issues don't take anything more than basic common sense to get through. So I'll just explain. Sorry, some of the statistics will be kind of UK centric, just because that's where I'm from. That's the data I've got. So what we see is an underrepresentation of certain groups in higher education. Okay, so that's not the whole problem, but that's part of the problem. Is that we have groups and individuals who feel that their racial, gendered, disability, sexuality, whatever the group they feel they're part of, is underrepresented. And if you see in the chart before you, of course, in the case of disability, we find the biggest and most frustrating gap, if you like. And I would say specifically about disability, remember, people who are disabled need physical access to buildings, to labs, to equipment, to particular adjustments. And those cost money. And sometimes institutions are reluctant to provide the adjustments that are necessary. So I think in the case of disability, we have the social barriers, but also a lot of physical and financial barriers or issues with institutions who are slow to comply or fail to comply with the requirement for adjustments for disabled people. But the overall picture is not very good. It is still, academia is still very, especially at the kind of higher echelons, dominated by white men. So this is, again, statistics, particularly from philosophy. What we see is that women come into the discipline at roughly 50% at undergraduate level, but then by the time you get to professor level, the ratio is something like 1 in 5. And so we want to try and understand what is causing this, okay? And then I think maybe 20, 30 years ago, maybe people said, well, look, women want to go off and have children. So obviously having a child and being very career oriented are incompatible. So this explains it. It's just women tailing off to go off and have children and be homemakers and so on. Now we know that men have children at the same rate as women, we do, of course, recognize that women disproportionately bear the brunt of childcare and housework, but that still is not an excuse. That might be a description or an explanation of some of the data, but it certainly doesn't give us a carte blanche, if you like, to excuse the data and to say, well, we don't need to do anything about it because this is just how wider society operates, that women are more involved in the home and the child rearing and men are more career oriented. And indeed, I think one very fundamental EDI point is that having a family and having a career are not incompatible goals, and people shouldn't have, men or women or anyone else, shouldn't have to choose one or the other and have to sacrifice the other. So this is what the data looks like. I don't know what it's like in physics. I'd be really interested to hear if people have any commensurate data to say how career progresses in physics. Now, of course, going off to have children and the underrepresentation of women in philosophy isn't the only problem. Of course, it's harder to speak up and to have your opinion heard when you're a minority person in the room, but there are also other issues to do with curriculum design, with the way in which discussion is handled, with the criteria for promotion, with hiring practices, and so on. So it's a much, much broader picture. The issues to do with equality, diversity, and inclusion have to do with all aspects of academic work, not just with this particular issue of representation. Now, if we want to try and understand why particular social groups are underrepresented in academia, why women are promoted less than men, why we have so few minority ethnic academics, at least in the UK institutions, why we have so few disabled staff, there's quite a few constraints that we can start looking at. Some of them are psychological mechanisms that I will explain in a minute, like implicit bias and stereotype threat. Some of them have to do with general workplace issues, such as harassment and microaggressions, which I'll also explain in a minute. Some of them are just pragmatic constraints. So, for example, during the pandemic, we know that across the board, women's research has taken a serious hit. Okay, so women take on more caring responsibilities, and now with the pandemic, it became obvious that women were the ones saying, "Oh, it's okay. I'll be at home doing the homeschooling with the kids," and a real substantial hit to women's research as a result. Now, what we can say about all of these taken together is that what we ultimately end up with is a sort of chilly climate towards members of underrepresented groups, where they are both the minority, they're exposed to implicit bias and stereotype threat, there are all kinds of social issues in the workplace, it might impact on them, like harassment and microaggressions, and they're the ones who bear the brunt of pragmatic constraints. For example, what I said earlier about disability and, of course, caring responsibilities. So what are implicit bias and stereotype threat? Well, they're well-established psychological phenomena that have been researched extensively in social psychology. If there's a social psychologist in the audience, I'd love to hear from you, because I am just reporting the findings of others. This is not an area of my own research. But implicit bias and stereotype threat are cognitive processes that are often unconscious that influence the judgments, actions, and actions we take and how we perform under particular circumstances. They arise from internalized associations between conceptions of the different groups and specific attributes. So here's an example to do with implicit bias. When we perceive individuals, we assess and interpret their actions and how they perform excuse me, in accordance with the kinds of attributes we associate with their social group. So, so people might feel less safe to be sitting in an airplane if they think a woman is flying the airplane. People might be less trusting of a male childminder. These are just two examples of possible kinds of implicit bias. And of course, we should remember intersectionality, which is really important here. Intersectionality is the way in which more than one attribute, more than one social group membership can affect people. So of course, somebody isn't just a woman, she would be a woman and also, you know, white or from another ethnic group, disabled or not disabled, from particular sexuality, particular gender, and so on. So nobody is just one thing. We all have this characteristic of having intersectional properties that create the people we are. And one possible issue is that they have this cumulative effect. So somebody who is a woman and disabled and lesbian and Black might face a lot more discrimination, hardship, implicit bias in academia than somebody else. Okay, here are two features of implicit bias, which make it quite difficult to address. The first is that most of us have these attitudes unbeknownst to us. So we might say, I'm sincerely and explicitly committed to equality. But in fact, in real life, in real-time situations, we might act in accordance with our implicit bias, even without consciously being aware of that. The second is that implicit bias isn't necessarily only directed to people who are members of other social groups than our own, but also towards our own. So I might sit on an interview panel and have implicit bias towards a woman who I'm interviewing in virtue of her being a woman. And me being a woman won't stop that from happening. And the reason there's a woman with a violin here is because there's a famous study of auditioning practices to orchestras, where the number of women selected for orchestras who undertook blind auditioning, so the musician would be auditioning behind a screen, so you couldn't see who they were and what they looked like, what they were wearing, their gender, and so on, massively increased the number of women being selected for orchestras that used blind auditioning. So I'm sure that people who sit on selection panels, interview panels, hiring panels are all sincerely and explicitly committed to equality and diversity, but we have this really powerful data showing that having that explicit commitment doesn't mitigate the effects of implicit bias. Here's a few famous examples. We've got the example of random identical CVs sent out to participants to look at. Some assigned a male and some a female name. And we see that both male and female participants gave the male applicant better evaluations and were twice as likely to hire the male than the female applicant, okay? And these are identical CVs. The only thing different is the name on top. References for medical staff exhibited really profound differences in the way in which they're written depending on gender, as you can see here. And this all really shows that despite our best intentions, implicit bias is a real problem. Moving on to stereotype threat. Stereotype threat consists in the operation of psychological schemas in a way that sabotages your performance to make it fit the stereotype. So you see in the picture, I couldn't find a more stereotypical picture of a woman throwing a ball, right? Her body language, her shoes, the way her wrist is angled, you can tell this is not going to be a good throw. And this is a woman throwing like a woman, to quote unquote. And if any of you are interested, there's a really interesting philosophy essay by Iris Marion Young called Throwing Like a Girl, which talks about this issue precisely, throwing like a girl. So she is throwing like a woman, if you like. And what stereotype threat does, it means that her throw will be less good than if she were throwing like a man because of this stereotype threat. So you perform in a way that fits the stereotype of being, I don't know, bad at sports, too feminine to throw hard, a ditzy woman, and so on. You can think of whatever stereotypes you have. Now, this is particularly amplified where the social group is negatively associated and where membership is made salient. So something as simple as saying, oh, it's the girl's turn to throw, which makes the girl identity salient, can be enough to trigger this stereotype threat reaction. And this is especially the case in high stake contexts. So think specifically here about job interviews, which is where people tend to be very, very prone to being influenced by psychological pressures of various sorts. Two features of stereotype threat.
Havi,
There are
Havi,
yeah?
Can you, sorry for interrupting you. We have exactly a question about that.
Sure.
And the question is, so would non-disclosure of irrelevant information be one possible solution to implicit bias problem?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great question. And it's spot on that one of the strongest mechanisms, not the only, but one of the strongest mechanisms we can use is anonymization. Okay. So when you're marking exams or essays, if instead of seeing that it's Jane Smith or Bob Jones, you just see the student number, you're taking away implicit bias because you don't have any information about the gender, for example, of the student. So absolutely, putting selection panels in a state of ignorance, if you like, about the identity of the people they're examining. So, for example, you can also have anonymized CVs. And one thing people always say is they say, oh, well, you can't anonymize CVs because people can Google the publications. Well, of course, people can cheat if they like. But if the CVs come anonymized and you explain to people on the hiring committee why it's important, then they're likely to respect that. So anonymization is a great and powerful mechanism. Thank you for that comment. Okay, so two features of stereotype threat. First is subtle ways of making membership identity salient have a greater effect than blatant ones. And the second is the more one cares about the activity in question, the worse the effects of stereotype threat. So here are examples. If Asian girls sit a math test, if the girl identity is made salient, for example, by asking them to draw a flower on the piece of paper, their performance is significantly worse than if their Asian identity is made salient. Here's another example. Black and white men play golf. If you tell them you're testing their natural athletic ability, the white men perform worse. And if they're told it's to test sports strategic intelligence, black men perform worse. Now, of course, implicit bias and stereotype threat interact. So when implicit bias others hold towards you is clearly manifested, that can also trigger stereotype threat. And here are the famous schemas that trigger these two psychological mechanisms, implicit bias and stereotype threat, most often. All the ones we know, and the ones that in some countries are protected by anti-discrimination legislation. Okay, so I said earlier that what we're talking about here is a chilly climate. And what happens is that these mechanisms, such as implicit bias and stereotype threat, and also other workplace issues such as harassment and microaggression, and also being a minority, so the only woman in the room, the only trans person in the room, the only non-white person in the room, that can lead to what we call chilly climate. And here is philosopher Alison Wiley saying, we ought to draw a distinction between explicit, formally institutionalized policies of discrimination, which hopefully we don't have many of these days, and a range of informal practices and implicit policies, which despite their relative subtlety and the fact that they may not be intended as harmful, do systematically disadvantage women relative to men. So the example here is women relative to men, but you can think of other groups if you like. So as you see in the picture, this could be a department going to have a drink after a seminar. So for example, here's a policy that is never intended to be discriminatory, but often ends up like that. So in the UK, a lot of departments have their research seminar last event of the day, say at 4 o'clock in the afternoon until 5:30, and then everyone goes to the pub. Now, not everyone goes to the pub, of course, because people who have caring responsibilities and have to pick up kids can't go to the pub at 5:30. people who observe religious principles of some sort, for example, Muslim people or others, will often feel uncomfortable in a kind of alcohol specific environment like a pub, so they won't come either. People who maybe suffer from social anxiety might not come either. And what you might find is that, yes, everybody is invited explicitly. Nobody's intending this to be a harmful practice, but actually only some of the people who are not affected by these issues will be able to come to the pub. And as we know, often very interesting things happen in informal conversations, work relationships and collegiality are reinforced. People talk about research, opportunities come up. So this is just one example. Another example is to have events that are important, such as department meetings or seminars, always on the same day of the week. So if I look after my kids and I only work Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and the departmental seminar is always on a Thursday, it means I can never attend it. And something you can do in response is to do a rotation, to say, okay, in 2021, the seminars will be on Monday, in 2022, they'll be on Tuesday, and so on. And that avoids that kind of pitfall. Okay, so we have this problem of chilly climate. And again, the point Alison is making is that it's the informal practices, it's the implicit policies, right? Because there isn't a university in the world who has discrimination as a flagship principle of its guiding its operations. But we do find that, again, on the micro level, there will be a lot of practices that can end up systematically disadvantaging members of minority groups of various sorts. So what constitutes a chilly climate? There's all these kinds of things. And again, the image here is taken from the TV series, oh God, what was it called, with Don Draper? Mad Men, that was running, I don't know, 10 years ago, I don't remember. It's the late 1950s. As you can see, all the women are secretaries. They're sitting there typing away memos. The men in the background with the private offices are the ones who are actually doing the important work. So what makes a climate chilly, we can see. If there is a failure to perceive a problem, so back in, I don't know, 1955, nobody thought that it was a problem that all the women were secretaries, that all the secretaries were women, and all the people doing the actual interesting work were men. So there could be a failure to perceive a problem. There could be various assumptions you make about women or other groups. People sometimes are afraid to speak, sometimes for good reason. Sometimes it's a shame because actually their opinions would have been valued. There can be a failure to act by line managers or people who witness microaggressions, for example, a failure to challenge, a failure to take seriously. The problem of harassment, which is again enshrined by law, so I'm not going to say much about it, but there's a whole host of ways of ignoring and trivializing and silencing people who come and say, actually, I don't feel comfortable in this context. Actually, I don't think it was okay to talk like that about this minority group. Actually, it wasn't okay to make that sexist or anti-Semitic joke in the classroom, and so on. There is often a lack of mentoring. And there can be sexual assumptions, comments, prying, commenting on people's dress sense and behavior and so on. And all of this can make a climate very chilly, again, especially if you're, the only one in the room belonging to a particular minority group. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead and just say one more thing, that the ability to detect a chilly climate is also very much differentiated, right? So if you're a senior, white, able-bodied male, you might say, hey, we've got a lovely department. The atmosphere is so nice. Everybody can talk. People feel very free to express their opinions. And that's because this person is typically not on the receiving end of any microaggressions. So climates are differentially experienced. And if you do want to find out what people think in your own unit, remember, it's very important to ask undergraduates, postgraduates, postdocs, early career researchers, not just the staff who have been there a long time and are feeling very confident. So people often say, everything seems fine to me. Oh, isn't this just a bit of exaggeration? This is just an isolated case. And that's ways of dismissing or shutting down conversations about equality, diversity, and inclusion that can be very important. Okay, so in the last 10 minutes, I'll say something specifically about what we can do. Well, of course, we can change the stereotype. So combating stereotypes is a really important thing we can do, especially as teachers, because we get to, influence large groups of students. But also we can change stereotypes for our colleagues by making pertinent comments in meetings rather than not saying anything and then regretting it. And there are ways to mitigate the effects of implicit bias and stereotype threat. So how do we change the stereotype? Well, we can revise our curricula, for example. We can say, well, I'm going to go back to my undergraduate syllabus on this course in philosophy and make sure that I have more articles by women on it. That I don't just use people's initials, but I say, Jane Smith and not just J Smith, because the default assumption is always that this is a man. When people organize conferences, they can be very sensitive to the question of representation. In the UK, in the US, again, there was this gendered conference campaign where people were invited to refuse to be keynote speakers in conferences where the lineup was all male. We can aim to have more equal representation of minority groups in research seminar speaker lineups. And when we cite in our research, we can also be proactively trying to change stereotypes. In teaching and learning, again, there's lots of stuff to do with reading lists, syllabi, topics covered, events for students. And you can ask people involved with teaching and learning to aim for greater representation for underrepresented groups. Now, here's an important effect of this. So we know, for example, women are underrepresented in conferences because of implicit bias. Their names don't come up when people are trying to think of good keynotes to invite. We know they get less invitations to speak. We know they're less cited. And we know that sometimes topics like feminist philosophy are considered peripheral or not important in my discipline. Now, of course, what happens is when you look at women's CV, all of this will have a cumulative effect. A woman's CV compared to that of a man in a similar career stage won't be as good because she won't have had as many publications. I mean, although again, this is largely addressed by triple-blinded review processes. She won't have been invited to speak at as many conferences. Her references won't be as glowing. So there's a sort of a double whammy that women, first of all, are underrepresented in all of these things because of implicit bias. Then their CVs don't look as good, but then it's actually a triple whammy. The third level is that even if a woman does manage to get her CV on a par with that of a male applicant, we know from the CV study I talked about earlier that her CV will be rated lower than that of her male peer because there's a woman's name on the top. So you see, there are different levels and iterations of barriers for success, and we can try and mitigate and try and intervene with each of these different stages. So what's not to do? Well, it's not enough to just tell ourselves, oh, I'm about to sit on a selection panel. I just won't be biased this time. I'll be really fair. Because of course, we just said that implicit bias is an unconscious mechanism. So people can't really just tell themselves consciously to stop being biased in the hope that that will work. That doesn't work. And don't pat yourself on the shoulder and say, oh, excuse me, I'll just do what I did last time when I was totally unbiased and I'll just do that again. What you can do is actually try and ensure gender or race fairness by giving more thought to the composition of various committees, like hiring committees. Pardon me. The problem is that, as we said earlier, women, like men, are likely to hold negative implicit biases against women. So just having more women on the committee on its own won't help. But that can, for example, help mitigate stereotype threat. And then the obvious problem is that then you say, oh, but then we have to have a woman every time we put together a hiring panel. And if there are fewer senior women than senior men, that could create an additional burden on those senior women who get called upon to sit on all these panels. So you have to really think about the impact of decisions you make and all the people, all the stakeholders, if you like, who might be impacted by decisions. Here's what works. Anonymizing, if you can anonymize parts of or all of the process of hiring, for example, of assessment, journal practices, which I mentioned. But of course, the one danger of anonymizing is if we said that women have had fewer conference invitations, fewer citations, fewer membership of learned societies or so on, of course, their CV won't be on a par of a man's. So there are some dangers to think about in anonymizing. I won't be talking about publications journals because I think, at least in philosophy journals, the overwhelming shift has been to blind reviewing, which should mitigate some of these issues, although it won't help with the kinds of stereotypes, negative stereotypes people associate with, again, for example, an area such as feminist philosophy as being not serious or not really philosophy. Another thing that works is spending time considering counter-stereotypical exemplars. So you won't know any of these women, they're all and men, because they are philosophers, so not from your field, but the one you might identify in the bottom row, the black and white photo, is of course Simone de Beauvoir. So we can really spend time showing our students, putting up a slide. If you're teaching the second sex, you put up a slide and you say, this is Simone de Beauvoir, or this is Simone Weil, or this is Martha Nussbaum. And put up a picture to show the diversity of people, the people you are citing. Being in a rush and being tired and hungry can increase the manifestation of implicit bias, because the more primal unconscious mechanisms tend to dominate, where you say, oh, come on, we've discussed these candidates for 3 hours. Oh, let's just go with this person. That is the kind of impulse or rush decision that will end up increasing the manifestation of implicit bias. Spend some time thinking about past instances where you were biased. So you think, okay, in hindsight, I know that this candidate made me feel uncomfortable. Why did they make me feel uncomfortable? What was going on for me? Offering bystander training, very, very useful way of training staff to respond in an appropriate way to microaggressions. Microaggressions are small instances of, if you like, put downs, ignoring, overlooking, trivializing the contributions of someone who is from a minority group. And again, good interventions enable people to reflect on the impact of their actions rather than to focus on defending their character. So a good bystander intervention isn't to say, oh, you were being so sexist in that meeting, but to say, knock on people's door quietly after the event and say, earlier in the meeting, I'm sure you didn't mean to, but when you made that comment, it came across as quite, I think you really hurt the feelings of, or I don't think it was really appropriate to point to so-and-so's clothes or whatever. Okay. And what we ultimately want to do is create an accountable community where people have the training, have an awareness, know how to respond to microaggressions in ways that challenge them, but also give people a better way of acting in the future rather than just blaming them. Okay, one good place to look if you're interested, the British Philosophical Association came up with guidelines, best practice guidelines that can help with things like gender bias, representation in conferences, sexual harassment, and so on, that you might want to have a look at. So what we did in philosophy is really just made it a real priority to to try and raise awareness of implicit bias and stereotype threat, even just within our own small department. And again, I'm not saying it's easy to make institution-wide changes or changes to legislation, but it is relatively within the gift of each and every one of us to have these kinds of conversations with our immediate colleagues, at least in the department, in the lab, in the hope of making a difference. So we can do all of these things to change things and make them better. And so the bottom line is that the message is very clear. So if universities want to attract women or ethnic minorities or disabled people to their communities, then the first step is for them to make sure those people feel welcome. Thank you very much.
Hello, Javi. Thank you very much for this great talk. You put there a lot of information, which is very hard to communicate. So I congratulate you also because you did it very fast. It seems people are preparing questions. I'm going to ask you an icebreaker question, and then we're going to move to questions of the audience. I remind everybody that you can ask questions in Slack because we are online. We don't see our faces. It's best if you try to keep a dialogue between everyone, follow everybody's conversation, like try to contribute actively and make your questions as precise as possible. And remember, try to be civilized. Javi, I would like to ask you a kind of provocative starter general question, and it's like, as a community of researchers, academics, why should we worry about not having diversity? What are the consequences of not having diversity for large communities? How can this have an impact on our communities and the way we do science or the way we interact? Just whatever you comes to mind.
Sure, thanks, Juani. Well, I mean, the impact is well, at least threefold. Three things I can think of. I mean, first is you're discriminating. Whether that amounts to a legal form of discrimination or not is immaterial. But first of all, you're creating or supporting an institution that is discriminatory in its practices. And that's bad for everyone. I mean, it's bad, of course, for the people from the minority groups who are the most affected by it. But it's also really bad for the people who end up working in a very homogenous environment. So we know that things like creativity and new ideas and even also a better workplace atmosphere are created by having diversity. So everybody stands to gain from it. And then, of course, there's the kind of, big tech companies, all that they're training on equality, diversity, and inclusion always says, well, companies that are inclusive and have a diverse workforce make more money because they're more successful. So there's also a financial, if you like, element there. But to me, the most important is to ask yourself, do I want to live and work within a community that is exclusionary and discriminatory and unequal? I think very few people would say yes to that.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very powerful message. We have lots of questions from the audience. Barbara is doing a great job trying to put them together. So some people here seem to be interested in evaluations, assessments, reviewing interviews. We have one question, for example, that asks whether there is an analog of anonymization in interviews or assessment centers. People are also interested in knowing more about your opinion on affirmative action or / positive action / positive discrimination.
So maybe, yeah, it's the kind of keywords were tokenization of certain groups, minorities, but also, well, one person specifically asked about your slide on hiring, which you skipped. So there's a strong interest in the audience about hiring processes and how they can improve that.
Okay, thank you so much. So first, on anonymization, I mean, you can't anonymize interviews the way you can music auditions, but you can certainly anonymize some aspects of the selection process, right? So in the shortlisting, you look at people's CVs and you shortlist according to that. So can you ask people to submit anonymized CVs? And you look at the CVs anonymously, and then you unblind at the stage of interview. So you haven't anonymized the whole process, but you've anonymized some of it. Another thing that is specifically really important to hiring is, I think, charisma and confidence, which you might say are sometimes associated with, being from the hegemonic group in a particular society, can influence an interview a lot more than we would like to acknowledge. So you can set up specific rules to do with hiring and saying, okay, we're not going to just make a global assessment. We're going to decide on criteria and weighting and stick to those. And if at the end result, we end up with a candidate and other people say, oh, but the other one, oh, he was so much more charismatic and funny, then you can say, well, is this, let's stop and examine really here. Is it that we're, as a panel of mostly men, more comfortable with somebody who is like us? I mean, we know that we tend to hire people who are like us or remind us of ourselves. So in hiring, there are specific things you can do. You can definitely start the hiring process by reminding members of the panel of the risks of implicit bias and stereotype threat, for example, and discuss ways to make sure that the hiring process is as equal and inclusive as possible. The third point about positive discrimination. In the UK, affirmative action is not legal, but we know that there are steps we can take that are not discriminatory, that don't selectively encourage individuals, but there are blanket processes. So for example, if you send all the people in the first year undergraduate course, all the people who got a distinction, a letter at the end of the year saying, you did really, really well. We acknowledge that and celebrate your achievement with you. Have you thought about the possibility of carrying on to do an MA or a PhD? Then we know that women disproportionately take on board that praise, and it gives them that extra confidence boost to maybe apply for an MA or a PhD that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So when you take an action like that, where you say, okay, I'm really going to email the top 10% of the class and give all of them the same encouragement, and in the knowledge that that encouragement might be differentially accepted by people and be more promoting for some, say members of a minority group, then that's of course a useful but non-discriminatory tool.
So we have another question from the audience. And to what extent do you feel these challenges are addressable by policy and cultural changes within the existing framework, changing hiring practices, changing attitudes, etc.? To what extent do you think these challenges are structurally encoded and requiring dramatic organizational, political, and economic changes?
Oh God, that's a really big question. I can't really answer that. I mean, again, I always think, you know, that in these kinds of cases, it's not an either or, right? You can say, okay, I want to cultivate a real culture of change that is bottoms up, that comes from the ground roots activists in each department, or the people who care about equality, diversity, and inclusion in each department. But that doesn't preclude going to the university senior management and saying, hey guys, have you considered these EDI issues in light of some specific policy or specific piece of work you have done? So it isn't an either or. I mean, I think sitting around waiting for the senior management or waiting for the government or waiting for the legal change, that's not particularly useful. So I don't think we need to say only this is effective or only that is effective. Well, we can think about short-term, medium, and long-term goals and say, well, in the short term, what I can do is have a coffee morning with my colleagues next week and talk to them about EDI issues and make some suggestions. That's not going to be as dramatic as a change to legislation that will affect the whole country, but it's certainly better than doing nothing. So I think the call is really on each person to do what they feel able to do. And if what you're able to do is just have a coffee with a colleague and say, you know, I think you sometimes come across as a little bit dismissive when this junior person speaks in the department meetings, that's a contribution. Every small thing is a contribution, and they all add up.
So maybe I will insert here a wrap-up question, because we are discussing many things. Can we maybe move to the concrete? What are some concrete things that people who are leaders or managers can do to improve their communities today? In particular, we're in a huge conference, one of the biggest content information theory conferences. So what can you do to improve these type of communities events if you are a manager or leader?
Okay, great. So again, I think talking about the issues, raising awareness and giving people tools are the most fundamental and immediate things we can do. If you Google bystander training, there'll be loads of material coming up online. And again, this isn't my main line of work at all. I don't even research feminist philosophy or inclusion. I started doing this in philosophy just because I cared about my discipline, and I cared about what happened to women in my discipline. And then it just, you know, kind of evolved from that to also include other minority groups. So as a manager or line manager, you can certainly do a lot more. For example, you can think about the staff review meetings you have and think about how to make them more supportive, how to increase the ambitions of minority, underrepresented group members. So for example, can you discuss promotion with women well in advance and dissipate any stereotypes they might hold, saying, oh no, I've got a young child, I can't really go for promotion now, or I haven't done enough, which is a very common thing that women say about the promotion as compared to men. So we know that women tend to always go for promotion later than men and wait too long, if you like. Whereas with men, sometimes the problem is the opposite, that they want to go for promotion too early. You can have a standing item. This is again something we do in the UK, a standing agenda item. So every meeting finishes with equality, diversity, and inclusion considerations to say, was anything we discussed today in the meeting, did that have implications that might be useful or detrimental to equality, diversity, and inclusion? So as a line manager, there's lots of things you can do, from adopting best practice, looking at particular areas of work within the department or the lab, doing reviews, asking people for their opinions, for example. So having focus groups or conversations, some tool for anonymous reporting so people can say, this happened to me, or I witnessed that, without having to say who they were. Having staff and students who know what is the accepted code of practice, what they need to do to be inclusive, making sure they have access to bystander training if they want it, asking people to be aware of EDI issues when they put together new courses. And the list goes on, right? So almost everything you do in your work has an EDI implication. And the point is to just try and be more and more conscious of that as you go along, as it were.
Maybe before we move to some take-home messages, can I ask you briefly, is there like a checklist that you should have, or prerequisite list that you should check to make sure your events are inclusive, that your communities are safe?
Yes. So for example, in my faculty, I put together, with the help of others, inclusion guidelines, which again, I'm happy to share with you if you want to adapt them or use them. They're just guidelines, and they don't cover everything. The problem is that, you can't cover everything in one document, but you can think of putting together inclusion guidelines, and they include, for example, if you think about events and you say, okay, how do you organize an event? Okay, you think of keynote speakers. You stop at that point and you say, okay, who are my keynote speakers? Are they all, eminent, senior white male colleagues, or can we mix things up a bit? Can we bring an early career person? Can we bring a woman? Can we bring somebody from another underrepresented group in academia? So checklists, again, there is so much stuff online. Every American university almost I've come across have lots and lots of stuff. There's lots of stuff in the British Philosophical Association, the American Philosophical Association. There's something called SWIP, Society for Women in Philosophy, who's done a lot of work on that. And I'm sure there'll be comparable work being done in other disciplines. So just go to the internet and have a good search. Everything is already out there. Nobody needs to reinvent the wheel, and just then choose the stuff that's most useful for your unit.
Thank you. I'll be putting all resources that are available right now in the Slack channel later, together with Barbara. So I'm happy to include that later. Just send me the links and I will put them there.
Great.
We're finishing the time we have, so maybe we can, focus on the big questions later in the Slack channel. And I would like to ask you, do you have any take-home messages to our Quantum participants?
Oh gosh, I mean, I think this is really a matter for you. So I've worked exclusively in a faculty of arts within my discipline, which is philosophy. And I don't know, I know there has been a lot of work on STEM subjects, again, in the UK. I can think of two things. I mean, one thing is, yes, do look at formal mechanisms, top level policies, at things like in the UK, we have the Athena Swan process for accreditation. There are these big, high level, institutional level processes taking place. But again, just going back to the take-home message, which is you don't have to wait for those. Think about how to empower and educate yourself. Think about how to empower and educate your colleagues or your staff if you're a line manager, and take it from there. I think there are so many immediate steps we can all take that don't require any change to university regulations, policies, law, and so on. That would really be my biggest message, not to wait. The other message would be to get the opinions and the views of the people in the department. And again, it's not enough to do this. If you have a departmental meeting and 30 people are sitting in the meeting, not everybody is going to speak. So if you're a line manager, again, is there a way to solicit the views of the people who are less likely to speak? The third is do feel free to, I guess, call out cases where the institution itself is promoting inequality. So for example, one thing that happened, an event that I heard about, is there was a member of staff who had sensory processing issues to do with the fluorescent lighting, which I don't know if you know if it's the same across the world, but in UK institutions, fluorescent lighting is very highly used. And this person was caused terrible headaches and fatigue by the fluorescent lighting, and they asked me to intervene. And there were lots of emails flying around about whose job it was to replace the lighting and how much it would cost to fit a dimmer, and can we get a quote, and can we send it on to the people? Anyway, months and months and months went by, and eventually I suggested that we just go into that room and just unscrew a couple of the bulbs to dim the lighting. And we went and just did that. And you can say, well, that's not exactly that's not according to protocol, and that's not process. And it is true. But, you know, after, if you wait for 10 months for an action to take place and it doesn't, then again, sometimes you have to think creatively, let's say, about solutions. So I do think that, yeah, thinking about how do we solve the problem rather than how do I trigger a process, or how do I, not being constrained by the mechanisms available, can sometimes be useful as well.
Okay, thank you, Javi. I think we finished the time we were allocated. There seems to be a lot of interest in the Slack channel though, so I encourage people to keep the discussion. Remind you that we can organize more events like this as a community, and that there are other diversity and inclusion events being organized at several other quantum information workshops. Thank you, Javi, and thank you, Barbara. Thank you to the organizers. The next item in the program